Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you ever so much for joining us today. Obviously, if you can see the whole screen, it's probably a gallery of 7 of us at the moment. Obviously, the plan here is obviously we're going to flip between obviously single screens of people speaking and then obviously galleries for when we have panels on. So forgive me if I start messing around with different buttons, and obviously you'll see different people as they pop up on screen as well. Thank you ever so much for joining us today. We're obviously going to hold on until obviously all the attendees are here. But just to give you a bit of a summary of what we're going to be talking about today. This is taking place at the Northern Ireland Science Festival, and it's the part 1 of 3 of a 3 interconnected events. They're going to be examining diversity of talent and where we can expect technology growth to stem from in the UK, Northern Ireland, and globally. And with this first event, we're going to be focusing on how bias can be conscious, unconscious, and AI driven. So delivered by Startacus, which is I'm one of the co-founders of, and in partnership with Matrix. We'll be learning about more about technology in this session and how AI can be a driving force for good, for change, or potentially otherwise. So we'll be finding out also hopefully a little bit more about how big global companies are addressing the moral code of getting AI right, or not perhaps as well. So in true Startacus inspiration and style, we like to kind of showcase startups and early stage founders. So this is a 1 hour, 15-minute session, which will feature 1 keynote, 1 panel discussion, and 1 relevant early stage tech startup who will be talking a little bit about what they're doing. And that is a team of Tara and Naomi, who have a early stage tech startup called MindMapper. So Tara and Naomi, thank you for joining us today. In terms of obviously the timescales and how the agenda is going to work, we're going to go obviously first me talking for a couple of minutes just to keep the flow going and waiting for all the attendees to join in. If you'll notice in my background, obviously I'm delighted that I am a science festival theme, obviously in my background. If you see the flickering of lights, it's just a poor green screen. It's not that I am actually up in space. So just obviously bear with us for about a minute or so until we obviously move on to the next section. Just obviously to say thank you to the sponsor on this and the 3 interconnected events that they're sponsoring here at the Northern Ireland Science Festival. It's Matrix, which is the industry leading panel with the primary aim to champion the role of science and technology as one of the key drivers of economic growth in Northern Ireland. So Northern Ireland obviously Matrix produces regular in-depth reports which outline the work and findings and recommendations of our specialist panels. These reports are an invaluable resource for anyone interested in how new technologies and market opportunities can be developed within the Northern Ireland economy. What I would say as well is obviously they're doing some great work in looking at STEM and diversity in STEM, and that's certainly something that I'll be following up with them as well, just to see how we can showcase and promote that as well. So as we just wait for a few more attendees to join in, what I probably should say is there is a chat function. Certainly feel free to use it. Just make sure that your language is appropriate. Obviously, in terms of with regards to recording, this is going to be recorded and it'll be available on playback. Obviously, anyone who's in the panel, hopefully that's fine with you. And obviously, just to say AI and bias is very much a hot topic as it is at the moment. So with regards to obviously the news, if you were just to type in AI bias and perhaps global companies across the world, they're all considering or kind of looking into how they can work around AI, focus on AI and bias, or obviously see if they're actually doing enough to address perhaps imbalance within their code. So delighted today to introduce you to Dave Graham, Diva and Gillian. They're on our panel. Dave is going to be the keynote speaker. Dave is a US technologist who is working at Dell in Boston. He also has done some work, obviously, the World Economic Forum, specifically around AI governance. So I'm really looking forward to hearing Dave speak. Diva is a award-winning co-founder of Sunbright Analytics, who are based in Belfast. And Gillian is a software engineer of more than 15 years. She works for Liberty IT in Belfast, and she's been doing some great work, and she's really passionate around ethical and human-centered AI. So thank you ever so much to our panelists for joining us today. Let me just kick on. So obviously in terms of Dave, Dave, if you want to turn your camera on, that'd be fantastic. There he is, Dave. He's got his jumper on saying Dell Technologies. He is of brand today. It's the first time I've ever seen you wearing some branded material, Dave, I should say.
I try to keep the kitsch to a minimum as much as possible, but yes.
Excellent. What I would say to anybody that's joining, irrespective of where they are in the world, Dave is not just a resource of knowledge, is also a resource of being able to support and help people within the tech ecosystem. So if you do have something which is really relevant and you'd love to talk to Dave, I think he'd be a great person to reach out to and engage with. So Dave Graham, you'll find him on LinkedIn. Dave, if you want to basically start sharing your screen, I will turn my camera off and obviously we can listen to your keynote speech. Thank you.
Yep, you'll just need to enable screen sharing.
Oh, thank you. I told you I wasn't a technologist.
It's all right.
Okay, that should work now, my friend. Is that good?
I'm assuming everyone can see it. All right. So yeah, thanks, Alistair. It's a great introduction. I hate talking about myself, so I'll keep that noise to a minimum here. Today, I really would like to talk about bias, what we call bias in the machine, right? Addressing bias in our AI-driven world. Like Alistair said, I work for Dell Technologies. I'm part of the Thought Leadership and Emerging Technologies messaging team there. So I'll give you a little background about myself. Yes, that is me staring off wistfully into the distance. Spent the last 2 weeks in Ireland. Gratefully, my partner lives there. So a little bit, again, like I said, I work for Dell Technologies. I look at how emerging technologies furthers both social transformation as well as how we can use technology to transform our daily lives. Part of this is a passion thing. My background is I came out of social work. I have 2 degrees in social work, a bachelor's in, not in social work per se, but in psychology and clinical counseling. Worked for the state of Massachusetts as a social worker. And as part of that, it's kind of that inevitable collision between, you know, what we construe to be real life and what people actually experience. And I was very formative into my views and how carrying society into technology or carrying technology back into society was built. Yeah, the other half of my brain is kind of devoted to my PhD work, which I am down at the University College of Dublin, part of their SMARTLab in the School of Inclusive Design, where I'm really looking at how data is used for social agency. You know, how do we take what we're creating and consuming, and how do we turn that into something that's more livable for us and changes society? Token kid shot here. This is really what I'm all about. Like this, you know, my 2 girls, and how this world is changing every single day for them is really everything that we work towards. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then pronouns, just because, you know, we're trying to be as inclusive as possible, obviously. I'm he, him. So bias, it's a pretty heady topic, right? We hear about bias and ethics all the time. And I think to a certain point, it gets tokenized a little bit. But when it comes to bias, we all start with presuppositions. We all start with an idea about the world around us. And while we say that can lead to bias, it always leads to biases. We always experience and we always color and shape our world in a way that we perceive. The grand paradox that we're dealing with here, of course, is the idea that AI can't be biased because it's just maths. It's just algorithms put together that process data. You know, growing up in the 80s, I know I'm aging myself a little bit here. We had the concept of garbage in and garbage out. I mean, concepts probably existed for millennia at this point, but we like to say, hey, everything that you feed into the machine is going to somehow get spit out on the other end, right? So it's only operating based on what it's being fed. And to a certain level, that's true. But AI is built by humans, right? We have a volitional role in how AI is shaped and created. So while the machine can be considered AI, we are as much in the machine as the algorithms that we built. And consequently, since it's built by humans, it's going to come with biases that are unique to our conditions as human beings, the world that we grew up in, the world that we experience, the places we've been, the people we've seen, talked to, and interacted with. So these biases are present in how we think. Now, this is a huge eye chart, so I apologize really much for this. And I do have the list of resources down here at the bottom, and this was put together. Yeah, sorry. I'm recording on other sides too. So the this is the cognitive bias side of what we're looking at. So this is 187 different biases that we all experience, right? And it's kind of broken down into these little quadrants, and I won't spend too much time here. All this is pointing at the fact that we are surrounded by it, that our brain processes this every single day, from the way that we store memories to the way that we draw to details that mirror our own beliefs, to the way that we imagine things and people that we're familiar with or fond of, to the way that we act and how we perceive that we should act within organizations in this. And all these biases feed into, like I said, how we act. 2020 has been a year of social foment, for all intents and purposes, right? We have, and I'm purposely using some images that are not designed to make you feel comfortable. Why? Because part of what we need to do when we confront our biases is to understand that they have real world implications. So part of this real world implication then is we have the issue of George Floyd or any of the people of color that suffered under misconstrued biases. Yes, that's the police officer that knelt on George Floyd's neck this past year and caused amazing, and I mean amazing in the most dreadful way, murdered a harmless individual, right? But his bias was that since George Floyd had previous encounters with the law, he must be someone who should be taken down, should be treated differently than anybody else. And it's terrible, but that's a bias that was exemplified. How about COVID? We, people tried to characterize or tried to, blame China for the genesis of this. And regardless of your political affiliation or geopolitical understanding, we called it the Wuhan flu, right? It was tossed around here in America to the detriment of the Asian Americans and Asian folks around the world. But like this, I'm not, we took our bias. So it was made in a lab in China, which is proven to be patently false. And we applied that to a people group around the world. And all of a sudden, this is, we're blaming this on innocence. We're blaming this on people. So you can see the real world implications of this bias. Now, this is just us thinking. Now, when we start to apply this to AI, we have to look at it a little bit differently. So bias is rampant in places and organizations that use AI. And yes, I'm calling things out here as well. Clearview AI, basically the ultimate scraping tool for technology and bias. It goes and gathers all this information, puts together a nice, neat little package and provides that to law enforcement services. You can buy, basically a clearly labeled set of data. Now, it relies on the fact that, bad actors are going to use this. And by bad actors, I mean people with, probable bad intent. Amazon Recognition, which is a facial recognition service as well. This was in the news in as much as the last couple of years for Amazon putting a halt on the use of this, or at least a pause, not a true halt. But why? Well, because it was being used in ways, the underpinnings data, it wasn't that the algorithm was bad, it was that the data that was being fed to it was from public records, which inevitably were biased towards people of color, and we're using mugshots. It's all in the news. How about mortgage and lending? It's something that, especially for folks my age, this has real world implications. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are two institutions here in the United States. Well, Wells Fargo is a massive multinational bank. Well, it was found out that some of the practices and algorithms that they were using were disproportionately favoring those who had higher risk, which led to the 2008 mortgage crisis. All these things, hiring practices within these organizations as well. The implications were massive. Social media. I mean, we only have to look at what happened through this past couple of, this past year with COVID and American politics, or politics at large, if you will, to see what the implications of that are. When it came to Twitter, how you could post a white person's picture and a person of color's picture, and it would always sample to the white person, or it would block out the person of color's picture within a post. Or Facebook, the algorithm used to determine what news rose to the top, being inimically biased towards one particular viewpoint or not. Now, these are real world examples. And something that strikes even closer to home, how about healthcare and insurance? Sure, not everybody has private healthcare. It's a unique affliction, let's say, to the United States as well. And that's a whole other argument for another time. But when you start to look at how people are cared for in the midst of their crisis, you start to recognize that the way that these machines made decisions, the way that these algorithms made decisions was based on bad data, was based on bad information that was leading to problems with their care. And so pull this out. And I have references for every single one of these things. So again, as a cursory topic, we're not trying to go in deep in how you should change your, convolutions and your neural nets to reflect a better reality, but I'm going to give you a call to action and something that we need to be careful of. And I'm going to start with an excellent quote from Kurt Vonnegut Jr. From his book, Hocus Pocus. The flaw in a human character is that everybody wants to build. We all want to be creative, right? We all want to build these algorithms. We all want to create the next best thing. And nobody wants to do the maintenance. Maintenance is an important part of creation, in as much as we want to be the creators. We want to do those startups. We want to build amazing things. And I've had the pleasure of working with Alistair over the past year on mentoring programs and working with Chris McClellan over at Ignite Northern Ireland and seeing some incredible things being built. But a lot of times the building process is always is the excitement. That's that endorphin kick, or that dopamine push, right? We want this. We want to believe that this is the best thing possible, but we don't want to do the work that continues to maintain it, that continues to move it on. And I'm sure that we'll discuss a little bit on this on the panel as well. But maintenance is an important part of this. It's not just a creation. So I proposed a real basic kind of cyclical process, if you will. And again, you can take issue with my words here, and I'm not a developer by any stretch of imagination. I understand enough about it to be dangerous. But the process I'm saying here is, first, we need to identify. You got to know what your biases are. I'm white, I'm American, I'm a male, I have privilege. I'm highly educated by all intents and processes. I have a bachelor's, a master's, and now a PhD that I'm working on. Like, I understand that my viewpoint is going to gear me towards a certain way. I don't know all of my biases, and I don't think there's a way for me to know everything until I encounter these moments. But also part of that identification is knowing what your market is, knowing who your targeted users are, and the potential impact or harm of what you're building. So you need to ask the tough questions. What are my biases towards the application I'm building, my business that I'm building, the algorithm that I'm building? And then what happens when these are actually applied? Curation, huge part of what we do. We talk about labeling within artificial intelligence. Your data sources need to be inspected and understood. Do you know where it came from? Do you know what this data set contains? Is there spurious information, and is there information that was gained from a very, very specific population with a very, very specific niche or application for it? So who created it and why? Understanding a little bit the volition of those who created it. Then you're going to build, right? We've identified it, we've curated it, now we're going to build it. We need to build our algorithms responsibly, incorporate feedback mechanisms that are human driven. I should have put an emphasis on that. As much as we may not like the fact of other people inspecting our code, inspecting our processes, inspecting what we do, there is rational thought behind it. Many of us have unique viewpoints that actually can bring up causes for concern. We want to look at both the positive, those words of affirmation. You built something that's really, really awesome. You should continue. And we need to look at the negative side as well. I think you're heading down the wrong direction, and be willing to solicit and process and incorporate that feedback. And then you're going to test and iterate. You're going to look at these algorithms and be willing to review the results. It's similar to what you see in education in testing a scientific process. Your hypothesis is what you're going to test. If your hypothesis is proven wrong, it's not a failure. It just means that you achieved a result that wasn't what you were expecting. So go back, figure out what that next process is. Ask the questions. If this moves into production, will the results I identified initially be validated? And if not, that's okay too. These are three incredible women. I have very, very little interaction with them, but I've interacted with what they have done. Starting from left, Timnit Gebru, who just recently was fired, let's be honest, from Google for attempting to cause people to think about ethics and bias within AI. And I say that intentionally. She stepped up and said something that we're doing is wrong, and she was mishandled completely inappropriately, I might add. Her work is seminal in this area. Professor Genevieve Bell, who's out of Australia, is an incredible person within the ethics and bias space within AI. Works for Intel. Her TED Talks are excellent. And then Rachel Thomas at University of California, San Francisco, who runs Fast.ai, another very, very powerful woman in this space. You know, they agitate, they attempt to do maintenance, do the hard work as much as possible. They're the ones asking those tough questions, saying, are we doing this the right way? And that's part of the maintenance process. So the opportunity, just to close things up here. Yes, eliminating bias is an ideal state. I hope it's achieved in my lifetime. I don't know that it will. And I'm getting older by the day. So just the fact that it may never fully be realized doesn't mean that we shouldn't stop trying to do that. Speaking up and speaking out, the forcing function of social transformation, I can't breathe. If you remember anything from George Floyd, it's I can't breathe. That was a forcing function. And that the dominoes falling since that statement was made caused incredible amounts of transformation, some positive, some negative. But the forcing function that we have by speaking up and speaking out is powerful. And you got to realize that you're not necessarily the only voice in the room. You are not alone. There are other people in your organizations, in the companies. Surround yourself by people who are willing to challenge your ideals and are willing to challenge the ideals of the establishment, so to speak. Education. There is no excuse for ignorance. I got the pleasure of talking with Dr. Helen Zedon down in Dublin. I'm doing one of the podcasts that I am delightfully able to co-host. And she said it this way: there is no excuse for ignorance. There isn't. There are so many resources at our fingertips, whether you're in academia or not. There is no excuse for this. So I put up aiethicist.org as a great place to start. It's a collection. It's pledges from people that have, decided to turn their lives and their missions into developing ethical AI. Finally, helping others. We're all part of a global community. The fact that I'm here in Boston and able to talk to you in Northern Ireland or wherever you are in the world shows this kind of community focus. If I can impart change, or I can impart the ideas or the seeds of change from here, what more could we do out there in the world? Ending with a quote from a gentleman whose book is called Morality, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, who recently departed this mortal coil. He wrote this in like the first chapter even. If we focus on the I and lose the we, if we act on self-interest without a commitment to the common good, if we focus on self-esteem and lose our care for others, we will lose much else. And that, in a nutshell, is exactly what we're trying to drive here. We lose so much by allowing these biases to step into what we do. If we're not willing to be part of the machine, if we're not willing to change the focus in the area and the nature of what we do within the machine, if we're not willing to confront this, if we're not willing to do the maintenance, not only the creation, but the maintenance and ongoing of that, then we're going to lose so much else. So thank you for attending. I would say this is my TED Talk, but thanks for attending today's keynote.
Excellent, Dave. I'm hoping that you can hear me. I'm going to jump in and start my video again. Dave, I should add, you made a topic which potentially could have been all about algorithms, all about people. And I think that's obviously where we probably need to start in terms of anybody's bias is thinking about it as a person as opposed to a piece of code. Um, my question to you is, if Google, as an example, you mentioned Timnet, and forgive me if the pronunciation is incorrect. 3 or 4 days ago, the other leading member of that team in the AI department, so to speak, looking at bias, was removed from their position. If a company like Google is struggling, perhaps morally or ethically, with having that discussion, and the ins and outs of why those two people left, I can't answer. There was various discussions around that. But what I would ask you is, what does a small tech company with 5 developers, how do they address the maintenance? And where do they start, would be my question.
Yeah, I think it starts from I always go to education first, because one of the biggest challenges is being willing to actually confront these head on. Reading, there are enough good resources out there. I think collectively as a team, set up a biweekly or a monthly kind of all hands, if you will, and say, hey, listen, this month we're going to talk about bias, or this month we're going to go down these things. Think of it as a book club, if you will, or a topic club. And the reason why you want to do this is that you learn so much in conversation. You learn about the nonverbals. You learn from your nonverbals with your development partners. If you're doing partner development, if you're doing any of this kind of pair development and whatnot, you learn a lot from those kind of subtleties that you experience there. A lot of it is just being willing to have the conversation, regardless of whether you agree or disagree. And I think that's the important part. We're so afraid of disagreeing with other folks. Yes, I'll point to Google a little bit. Google had a consortium a few years ago where they tried to set up an ethical AI, group, and they brought folks in, and somebody from a known think tank that is, let's say, right leaning, I think it was Heritage Foundation, was invited to join it, and all of a sudden the thing fell apart. While you may not agree with what that Heritage Foundation does, the fact that they have a dissenting voice should not have negated the role of that consortium together. And I think we're so afraid of having dissent in our ranks that we're unwilling to confront what that dissent is. So with 5 people or 5,000, being willing to have the conversation, knowing that there's going to be disagreement, is the first step towards bringing this together. And it should foster unity, because you suddenly realize that, this family, this little company, this idea that we're building is made up of all these different pieces, these different parts. And that's actually pretty fantastic and should continue that way.
Excellent. We obviously have to move on in a second, but there's a couple of questions that have come in. Jason asked, how do you handle any bias you realize you hold when approaching a solution to an ethical AI issue? That's a whole debate in itself, but Dave, any quick answer?
Yeah, I think it's being willing to take it. I'll say this in a kind of way that doesn't necessarily make sense, but it's kind of paradoxical in the same way. Take it personally. The fact that somebody is calling you out, or the fact that you discover something, take it personally. Try to understand why that offends you. Why does that little bit and piece, why does that cause me to stay up at night? Go find it. Go, again, plug it into Google. Say, hey, Google, tell me why. What is this thing that I'm struggling with? And start that voyage of discovery. Again, you might not necessarily agree with the end result of that, but you're trying to discover what it is that triggered you down that path, right? And that's the first part of it that I can talk about, obviously.
Yeah.
So we'll start from there. Yeah.
No, perfect. And obviously I picked up on the fact it's not really a left thing. It's not a right thing. It's not a political thing. It's not a right or a wrong thing. It's a human thing. We need to get that as a human-centered approach to understanding. Obviously, it's not necessarily whether it impacts you, it's whether it impacts everybody. Is that a fair reflection?
Yeah, you are part of everybody. It sounds very new agey, but you are part of everybody. You're part of the community just as much as your neighbor down the hall is part of the community. These other businesses that you interact with are part of the community. And again, it goes back to what Rabbi Sachs said. When we start to take the focus off of I and we start to look at we suddenly change the worldview that we're operating on. I know that I can still do this job. I can still be part of Dell Technologies, right? I'm one very, very tiny cog in a 150,000 plus person machine. But I start to be able to deal with the reality that I can start to impact change with just in my little locus of control here. And I'm going to focus that energy there. I'm going to take that and do that. I may not affect 150,000 people, but I can affect 5 people that I deal with. I can affect 20 people that I deal with and move from that point.
Excellent, excellent. Dave, you're going to come back in and we're going to have much more major conversations around this topic. Bing, who's asked a question, I'm going to come back to that if that's okay. How do you balance the unconscious bias of AI? Balancing something which is unconscious is a hard trick, I'd imagine. But Bing, we'll come back to that in the discussion that we have. Dave, if you want to just, obviously, I'm going to give you a round of applause anyway, even though no one else can. Thank you for your time, and much appreciated. If we were in a hall, I'm sure there'd be lots of clapping. And obviously, if anyone wants to drop in any chats just to say thank you very much, that would be awesome. It would also be nice to know whereabouts in the world you are as well. So obviously in the chat, if you want to basically just mention where you are, it'd be lovely to know where our audience is today. And yeah, Naomi, obviously, and Tara, who are up next, they're going to be talking about their early stage startup. Naomi, the question directly is to your question in the panelists thing. I'm just going to say you don't need to mention bias at all. This is not about obviously just specifically bias, but I would imagine obviously with your technology, there is some unconscious bias that perhaps that you would need to consider obviously when you're developing your business. So Dave, thank you very much for your time today. Naomi and Tara, if you want to turn your cameras on, that would be fantastic. Excellent. I can see lots of people that are panelists, but hopefully they can only see us three. I'm just going to double check my slide sharing is still on, and it is. So I'm going to turn my camera off and I'm going to pass over. Jason says sitting in Belfast. Thank you ever so much. Brilliant, Dave. Thank you from Nuri. Great to have some lovely feedback in. So I'm going to turn my camera off. Naomi and Tara, the floor is over to yourselves as well.
Hello, everyone. It's lovely to be with you today. Tara and I are going to talk to you about our very early stage startup. So I'm just going to share my screen. Is that okay with you, Tara?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And share. So can everyone see? Oh, hang on now. Can everyone see that now?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay, Tara. You ready to go?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I don't know what happened there. Oh, I do know what happened. There we go. Okay.
Okay. So did you know that over 120,000 people in Northern Ireland wait more than 1 year to access mental health services? Given that poor mental health is the #1 cause of disability in Northern Ireland, this is a truly shocking figure. For a second, consider the scale of the problem globally too. A major obstacle for GP referrals to talk-based therapies is the lack of an evidence base and a quantitative means of assessing improvements in mental health. Here we have Sarah, a typical talk-based therapist. Therapists like Sarah assess their clients' progress relying on their own observations and their clients' self-reporting based on their own current mental health state, and this is based on a scale of 1 to 10. But this rating will vary from person to person, as one person's 6 could be another person's 4, leading therapists like Sarah to ask questions such as, how can I validate the positive improvements in physical brain activity my clients experience as a result of therapy? Introducing MindMapper, an innovative Fitbit-type tech solution to the problem that will provide objective and quantitative measures of progress using algorithms to track changes in brain activity over the course of therapy intervention. With MindMapper, therapists like Sarah can objectively validate a patient's improvement because of their therapy, thus increasing confidence in talk-based therapies, which in turn will increase GP referrals and ultimately decreases GP and mental health service waiting times, thus also reducing mental health costs, which are currently at £41.8 billion in England alone.
Therapy provides the client with tools that help them to help themselves. It's through active participation using these tools that the client improves their mental health. MindMapper aims to provide a visual and quantitative measure of this improvement. Ultimately, MindMapper will be to mental health what a Fitbit is to physical health. As you can see from the diagrams on the right, MindMapper will operate much the same as a Fitbit, using an app on a tablet device to set up or select a profile and connect with the hardware device to analyze the data being recorded and outputting the results using graphic informatics. Over the course of the therapy, the therapist can use this objective and quantitative information to assess the client's progress. And should that progress be positive, this will reinforce the client's efforts, and should it be slow, it will signal to the therapist that a different approach might suit this client better and they can make the necessary change. So how will MindMapper work? On the left-hand side of the slide is a model of the Flex Eeg Cap, a low-cost, non-invasive electroencephalography or EEG wearable headset that records the electrical activity of the brain. The Flex EEG was developed by Neuroconcise, an Ulster University spin-out company. Neuroconcise has agreed to provide their services to develop the MindMapper headset and software based on the framework of the Flex EEG system.
In providing a solution to this problem, our team currently has 2 members, myself and my co-founder Naomi Dubois. As a qualified hypnotherapist and psychotherapist, I bring to the team the advantage of having direct customer insights to the problem MindMapper is addressing. In addition to this, I have over 20 years experience in financial analysis and project delivery. My co-founder Naomi is a research associate at the Intelligent Systems Research Centre at Ulster University Magee campus. Naomi's qualifications and expertise lie within neuroimaging and psychology. Together, our founding team have the skills and insight necessary to engage with every step of the process required in developing our solution within the neurotechnology market opportunity that we've identified. The worldwide market for neurotechnology products is predicted to reach $13.3 billion by 2022. MindMapper's long-term strategy is to be a key player in bringing the benefits of neurotechnology to the traditional therapy types, initially targeting the UK and Republic of Ireland markets with medium to long-term goals in exporting to Europe and the United States. To gather evidence that this is a big opportunity, we've conducted market research via surveys to currently practicing therapists and facilitated a focus group to validate the problem and get feedback on our potential end users. We've spoken to industry experts and from the public and private sectors, as well as support agencies and networks shown in the slide to validate our problem and the effectiveness of our solution in relation to what we aim to achieve.
Here we have the timeline for the project plan for the next 3 years. The research and design phase will be carried out in year 1, followed by clinical trials in year 2, and finalising the commercialisation steps in year 3. Our aim is to deliver the first MindMapper analyses algorithms by 30th of June, followed by a proof of concept by 30th of September this year. Neuroconcise has stood out as the best option as a supplier, given the Flex EEG system can provide a basic framework for the MindMapper software. MindMapper and Neuroconcise have discussed the feasibility of the plan, and we are satisfied that Neuroconcise can deliver the minimum viable product effectively and efficiently, given their expertise in developing similar neurotech systems.
For the next 12 months, our main focus will be initially securing funding. At present, we're seeking funding through InvestNI in the form of research vouchers and also through an IT for Anxiety Interreg project. Funding from this European project will provide us with access to a European network of healthcare professionals that will assist and support the clinical trials necessary for the validation and development of our MindMapper device and open the door to the European market right from the very beginning. We will also secure a legal formal agreement in assigning intellectual property rights for bespoke software, and will also obtain CE marking at this stage. Upon completion of this, we will then roll out a large-scale clinical trial to validate the effectiveness of the MindMapper device and software. The scalability of MindMapper is vast, and future trials will include other therapies and multiple disorders. Thank you for your time. We look forward to answering any questions that you may have.
You're muted still. Sorry.
there was always going to be a slight technical issue. That was it. So obviously, in terms of AI or the algorithms that you're going to build around that, do you want to have a talk, just a little bit of an explainer around obviously the tech that obviously you're implementing on the back end for this?
So we're using electroencephalography or EEG to record brain activity. I don't know how much people know about EEG, but basically it records the electrical activity from neurons firing in the brain. So there are three main networks, neural networks, that are known to maintain mental health issues. And what you tend to look at are the functional connectivity, or the strength of connectivity between hubs within those networks, and also other markers like alpha rhythm, brain rhythms, to see how healthy these networks are. And over the course of therapy, clients actually improve the health of these networks. But, and this is seen in many research projects that have looked at the impact, on improving functional connectivity within these networks using therapies like hypnotherapy, cognitive behavior therapy, etc. So we know that this happens, and it would provide, it's a quantitative objective measure that just at the moment, the resources aren't there for therapists to tap into to show this to clients. So they have to resort, or not resort, but they have to rely on subjective measures, which, as Tara explained, is prone to bias. So,
yeah.
So that's what we're hoping to bring to therapists.
So how obviously do you, from the technical element to this, how do you be able to manage whether the data that you're acquiring, or obviously the information that you're using about certain types of people, is not full of bias in the first place as well? How can you monitor that in a sense as well? One's assuming that there's some assumption made about gender and race and certain elements that might impact on mental health. Is that something that you can control as well?
As the algorithms that we would be using would be literally looking at functional connectivity, it wouldn't, gender wouldn't be factored in to the functioning of those networks. I know that there are gender differences or sex differences in the connectivity in the brain, but that wouldn't impact on the algorithm's ability to measure the functional connectivity within those networks. And
Great.
also the data would be, there would be cloud storage would be used, but all data would be anonymized. So working in the area of research, that's something that I'm very familiar with. It's very important that all data is anonymized.
Great answer, Naomi. And so obviously, just leading on from that, Dave, Diva, and Gillian, if you have a question, certainly feel free to ask it. We've got about a minute or so, and then we're going to move on to the panel. But obviously, in terms of what comes next for you, and obviously Tara, Naomi, and Tara, what's the plans over the next couple of months? Obviously, proof of concept, and then obviously let's hope that some investor comes in, or someone like Dave from the States says, "Oh, this is something that Dell could support."
That's it. Tara, do you want to take the floor for a minute? You're muted.
Steps will be securing funding in which we can develop a proof of concept to get a minimal viable product that we can use to test for the clinical trials. We will be securing the software, which will be our unique selling point for MindMapper. And what that software will do is that will, whenever the data is taken from the neuroimaging device, what our software will do, it will translate that to an easily interpretive, very visual format that will allow non-neuroimaging experts, such as therapists, to easily track their clients' progress over time. So this will be a real game changer for talk therapies, allowing them to, become more current and compete in the neurotechnology market. So we really need to get this secured now and validated. So that'll be our aims for the next 12 months is really, you know, getting the funding to get the, you know, the proof of concept where we can, you know, have a product that we can use in testing, really just to validate that this can be done to allow us then to start producing this.
Excellent. Obviously, like anyone listening in, it's always nice to champion someone, a team that's very early stage. And Naomi and Tara, if I remember correctly, came together around September last year during lockdown, and a virtual co-founders program, which is run by Catalyst in Northern Ireland, which brings people together with different skills but similar passions. So it's fantastic to kind of map the journey, pardon the pun from Mind Mapper. But Naomi and Tara, I wish you all the best going forward. Lovely feedback. Peter does ask an ethical question, I think. I don't know if it's an ethical question or not, but how does mental health issues cause disabilities? That's a really good question. And Naomi, I think we should answer that just really quickly, if that's possible.
Yeah. So it can cause, say, if you take a mental health issue like post-traumatic stress disorder or depression, that can actually cause people to lose a lot of time, you know, they're forced to take a lot of time off work, and it can it impacts very much on relationships, attachment with people's children, attachment relationships, which are very important. And so it doesn't just end with the person who has the mental health, which is very disabling to their lives. It also impacts on those that they have close relationships with as well.
It's a good answer. And like, obviously, in terms of disability, it's not always a physical disability. And obviously, I think we all need to have that conversation around mental health, and we all have mental health. It's how we are able to sometimes deal with it. My dad has a head injury, and sometimes, unfortunately, he can't balance that. And obviously, it would be great to have something that would be able to track his current cognitive feelings, if that makes sense. Naomi and Tara, thank you ever so much for your time today.
Thank you very much.
By all means, obviously, stay and listen in for the rest of the panel. I'd love you to. And obviously, if you want to turn your cameras off, obviously, and we'll go on to the panel now. Thank you. Dave, Diva, and Gillian, if you want to turn on your cameras, that would be fantastic. Thank you. Diva and Gillian, I thank you ever so much, obviously, for just waiting your time, if that makes sense. Do you want to basically just, because forgive me, my explanation of what you do is probably really bad. So Gillian, do you want to just introduce yourself and what you do?
Sure. I'm Gillian Armstrong. I work in software engineering. I'm a solutions engineer, and I work in our incubator space in Liberty IT in Belfast. And we have an office in Dublin as well. And we're a child company of a big insurance company called Liberty Mutual. And a lot of what I do is around applying AI. So we look at AI, we look at how we can apply it and how we can use it for the company, how we can build it into our existing applications and build new applications with it. So I am very, very interested in what we're doing, how we can use AI and how that's going to affect the world going forward.
Excellent, thank you. And Diva as well, obviously, over to yourself. Thank you.
So I'm Deva. I
Sorry,
hope
Deva,
everyone can hear me. So I'm a computer scientist, and I'm also the co-founder of Sonry Analytics. So we are a smart data analytics company based on here in Belfast. And I am one of those people who are a bit of a hybrid because I wear two hats. So I am the co-founder of Sonry Analytics, but I also work in Queen's University Belfast as a research fellow, where I work on cardiovascular disease and cancer research. And in all of these roles, my part is, because I'm coming from computer science and because, you know, the software engineering background, I work with both your traditional programming and artificial intelligence-based programming to identify better ways in which we can essentially analyze healthcare data, if that makes sense. So yeah. Things like bias, therefore, is something that's always in the front of my mind when we're working on projects.
Okay, so Liberty IT, I'm double checking on this. They do insurance, is that right? Or they build things around insurance?
Yep. So Liberty IT here in Belfast and Dublin it's fully a software house, but we build products solely for Liberty Mutual Insurance.
Got you. Happy days. And then obviously you've got someone from Queen's who's looking at obviously bias within health. So happy days. There's some connectivity, I think, there, even though you've not met before, I believe.
Correct. Yeah.
There you go. The one good thing about COVID, and there hasn't been many, I have to admit, is that it's bringing people together from around the world. So I don't know, Gillian and Deborah, if you've had the opportunity to meet with Dave before, but hopefully you enjoyed his talk. And there was a lot of thinking points, I think, obviously, that came out from that. Gillian, I'm going to start with yourself, if that's okay, listening to what Dave was talking about. And I'm going to ask this question. How do we define fairness? Because perhaps I think it's fine at the moment with AI. There's no problems, obviously, in terms of bias. I'm the head of a company. I'm white, I'm bald, I've got glasses, I'm middle-aged. I'm pretty the typical CEO. What if I haven't got a problem with it? How do we define fairness in the first place?
Yeah, I think that's such a good question, because you can't measure what you can't define. So how do I know that there's no bias in my AI? Well, if you can't tell me what bias is or what would make it fair, then, you know, I can't prove to you there's no bias in it, or I can't measure if it is biased or unbiased. But things do get a little bit complicated very quickly, because obviously if you said, well, what does it mean to be fair? A human kind of dictionary definition would be, well, you expect people to be treated, you know, impartially. There's no discrimination, no favoritism. But whenever you get to AI, that's mathematical. As Dave said, that's maths. So how do you define what fair is there? And there's a few different definitions out there. People have taken a stab at it, and they are statistical definitions. So things like, well, you have equal false negatives across all groups. So what does that mean? Well, we do the same harm to everybody. And this actually brings in a really good point, because we would love to think that AI is like 100% accurate. And so when we're defining fairness, that we are making the assumption that it's always going to be right. And so therefore, we're just getting it right for everybody all the time. But actually, it's not going to always get it right. And you may be thinking, well, I don't feel super comfortable if you're saying, well, we're going to get it wrong the same amount of times for every group. And probably if you're the one person who's got your mortgage rejected incorrectly, you're not going to feel very consoled if I say, well, it's okay, because we incorrectly rejected the same number of people from every group. So don't you feel fine about it now?
It's a really kind of subjective conversation, and obviously again playing on the fact, and I am not any of these things, but just to pretend I continue to be that CEO of the typical company, obviously, which is FTSE 100 and is pretty much obviously going to be a white middle class man with glasses and a bald head. Deva, sorry. How do you get that through to someone at the top of the empire on a human level? Because obviously, as someone that's not a techie, listening into tech talk, it's sometimes difficult to understand what actually this means.
Well, the way I see it, so if you're not talking in terms of a techie, and if you're looking at this as just a person, now there's two views. So if you're talking about the CEO there, you're talking about people specifically in business, or if you're talking about, just us, the average humans, that's another different viewpoint. Because I think what you need to understand is one particular explanation is not going to fit all groups of people. So depending on the group of people that we're communicating with, we kind of need to change these definitions to fit them. Because, whichever cause I'm fighting for may not resonate in the same way to another group of people if I'm using the exact same terms that works for me. So if I am talking to the CEO, what I would tell them, because as a CEO or as someone who's the head of the company or in the executive level, what you're concerned about is bringing in profit to your company, right? Mm-hmm. Now, the reason that we need to consider things like bias is because that lets us realize the fact that means we need to stop having these homogenous groups of people, within our teams, because what that does is that actually closes off entire sections of the market from us, because you can't reach out to a lot of people and you're not getting different levels of skill. So that's why you need diversity. So instead of going to them and telling them, this is why you need to have, heterogeneous groups of people representing you, because, it's great for the society. Yes, that's brilliant. That's what we should ultimately be concerned about. But unfortunately, because we're talking to the executive level, it's better if we approach it in their language, which is to say, look, guys, if you're implementing, if you're bringing in more people from diverse groups, if you're getting people in from different ages, and then, different social standings, and then obviously different race standings, if you're bringing these people in, every time you're bringing these people in, you're bringing in new skills into your table, which means you're opening up new market shares, you're opening up, places which your product can reach into. So I think if I was talking to that particular type of CEO, that's what I would tell them is, hey, if you're going in, if you bring in these different types of people, here's the way that you can actually increase your profit, which ultimately also serves my purpose, which is to make sure that the society is going to be less biased. But I think that's the thing, is that we try to
humanize
humanize
it in a biased way. I would suppose you might suggest, obviously, to the language that someone that is going to understand the power of money, the economic benefit. In a sense, Dave, I want to come back to you on that and ask, is that fair in itself that I'm trying to think of the analogy that I could use on this, and forgive me if it's the wrong one, but if I said, obviously, I went to the president of the United States of America and said, look, Martin Luther King, economically, we need to work on this, because obviously economically, our economy is going to be better if we look at bias in society. Should we be ethically talking on that language to CEOs? Do we need to have some kind of policing of this, which is above the CEO level?
Well, that's a can of worms for sure. I think we are fast moving towards an idea of governance and external governance. And the reason being is, even from that news clipping I pulled out about inimical bias within healthcare, these are external audits that go against affected people, right? And I think government is an upside and a downside. I'm not playing on one side of politics or another. There are reasons why it becomes good. There are reasons why it holds people accountable. And so when we look at something like the World Economic Forum, which is a non-government agency, right? It's designed to kind of float within those barriers and those really the geopolitical morass that is humanity. There are ways that we want to influence the governments to start thinking about these processes, right? You're going to develop these guidelines, these frameworks that will bring you to our inevitable conclusion. I think, to echo a point that Jillian brought up, there is no universal fairness in any of this. While the Declaration of Declaration of Independence says all men are created equal, the fact that there's only the word men in there points to that. We want to believe in this ideal that everybody is on the same page, yet we've created societies, we've created governments, we've created these institutions that don't kind of create an inequality. So getting back to your initial statement, these external audits and companies, whether governments institute them or they're done privately or whatever, you always have to understand the volition behind it. What is causing this to happen? What is causing this to be instituted? Who is doing this and why? But also the willingness to submit your stuff, knowing that, going back to what I said as well, that you're not necessarily always going to get the most positive response to what you've done. If I go and Google certain companies and they show up on the Immigrations and Custom Enforcement list of the United States of America, which we know is a heinous institution altogether, does it the fact that a certain company that shall not be named work for them or provide them supply, is that a good thing or is that a bad thing, right? Is that fair? Is that equal? Well, they're making money and they're doing things, but they do a whole bunch of right. Does that offset the bad? Like all these things, we're being held accountable, and society has ways of holding us accountable already to it. News, public, the public forum of information. So I think we are headed towards a governance board or body within different governments around the world, whether it be through UN kind of institutions or otherwise. But it's also going to rely on the actual sovereignty of nations to do this and say, hey, listen, it's not okay that we've, castigated, we've committed genocide with this group of people, and holding those people accountable for those decisions that have been made. So.
Okay, good. Well, not good, obviously, and I think that's probably the point. And in terms of good or bad, and whether things are being accountable, Gillian, how can we tell if harm has already been done in terms of obviously the way that AI is being used or has been used?
I think this is where it comes back to your definition. So we need to have, and there's no universal definition of fairness. It is going to be different in different places. But if we have an agreed definition of what we consider to be fair in a certain circumstance or a certain place, then we can evaluate against that. You can be held accountable for whether you've met what you say you agree to as being fair. Now, how do we do that? That is much trickier. We have, Dave mentioned maintenance, really absolutely key. So when you've put something out there in the world, how are you going to monitor it? How are you going to know what's happening? I think the more and more I work in the AI space, the more and more things I look at, I don't think we're in a world where you can have AI operating without any human oversight and actually feel comfortable that you're going to have got it perfectly right. I think we need humans because ultimately, bias, fairness, privacy, security, all these things, they're in the human realm, and humans should be making decisions, and humans should be looking at it and making the call and saying, this is the right thing or the wrong thing. I know we might talk more about it. There is ways of mathematically monitoring it, of keeping track of like, okay, I want you to look at like these different groups and tell me if things are getting unaligned. But ultimately, there's going to be things come up that you never thought of. There's going to be your unconscious biases. There's going to be your unknowns. Someone is going to come along and say, this thing happened, and it's not even going to have crossed your mind that it may have been something that could have happened.
There's a great point again, and Deva, I'm going to come back to yourself on this. And it was a question that Bing asked in Dave's presentation. How do you balance the unconscious bias of AI? Like, how do you keep track of someone's unconscious or a team's unconscious bias?
Well, I think one of the main things is, so whenever you look at AI, because we do have this thing, we always think about it as though the bias is in the AI, but like the other guys have been saying, it's not always in the AI. It happens before we even get to the point of AI, right? Because you have your data sets that you put in, because at the minute, so far, the AI systems are trained by humans. They're not trained by themselves. Which is a good thing for the moment, because we still haven't figured out what we're doing yet. So you have the data sets, so all of these that's going in. So when we're curating it, right, just like Dave said, that's the point where we can capture these things. And then it comes to the point of the actual people who are coding it on the floor, right? So that's another point. So if you have a team of people who are coding your AI, who are all, who have the same mindset, or who are coming from the same status, kind of the same bubble, it's very difficult because, we have this thing, I'm sure everybody's heard about this, called the empathy gap. That is to say that, we have this thing where we tend to empathize with people who either look like us or who come from same standings as us. That's easy. It's a human thing, and, it is what it is. And evolution-wise, back in the day, when we were hunter-gatherers, it worked because you kind of needed to do your tribe from the other tribe so that you didn't end up getting killed. So we inherently have these qualities. But the problem is we don't live in the jungle anymore. We live in concrete jungles, but that's a different story. We don't live in the same, evolutionary status as we were before. So we developed ourselves and we have a global community. So in those situations, I think one of the main things is, like I said, have a diverse team. Because if you have a diverse team, if you're not catching the bias yourself because you're biased towards something, the guy or the girl who's next to you, the person who's next to you, they are going to be able to say, when they evaluate the code, they're going to be able to say, oh, but why did you, why did you choose this particular data set? Or why did you, use this particular matrices? Or why did you have a look at your actual model, AI model, in this way? Because what we need to do, the way we can hold people accountable, sometimes it's kind of, you have to, because you can't always police yourself as much as you would like to. So sometimes it's important to have that network effect, the almost what do you call it, the blockchain effect almost, where everybody's policing everybody, so that it's a community. So I think that's why in terms of unconscious bias within your actual coding side of things, that's why you need to kind of try to have a diverse team as much as possible. But then also make sure that you're getting the data from the right place, and then subsequently you have to test the things that you've built, and then once you put it out in the world, you have to still continuously keep testing, and and also encourage healthy debate where people can question you, people know that you can be approached and they're not going to get murdered just because you ask a question. Is also important, I think.
No, thank you, Deva. And I'm going to come back to Gillian on this. Dave, I'll come back to you in a second. But Gillian, I'm going to think of insurance and the pandemic. We're kind of at the point, obviously, in terms of awareness of obviously how people are impacted by the pandemic, that there are some groups that potentially are more impacted by obviously the pandemic and the disease than others. How have you managed to kind of go past that general overview in terms of obviously perhaps obviously building technology that doesn't discriminate against the whole group when they're trying to get insurance or health insurance specifically? Or is that something that's even being looked at the moment?
So I don't work with our health insurance. So I couldn't give you details on the specifics of what they're doing over there. I know it's something that is being talked about. It's something that people are thinking more and more about. It's not something that I think is as embedded as it needs to be right now. When I build software, there are all sorts of things that I have to do before I put it out there. I have to have a privacy review. I have to have a security review. I have forms I have to fill out. They have to go to specialist groups who specialize in, the legal or privacy or security. They have to review everything that I've done. I have to go and meet with them and talk through. There's no ethical checkpoint before we go out where I have to explain, why I'm using different things or how I'm going to, mitigate any potential bias. I have to tell them how I'm going to mitigate any potential privacy or security issues. But bias isn't something that is built in, or ethics even. It isn't something that's built in to that software development process yet. And I really think it does need to be. And I think that's when we're going to see the governance and things like that, like Dave talked about. I think that's going to help shift it, I hope. Because at the minute, I think it's very much at an individual level where individuals or teams, if they're thinking about it, they're pushing for it in the company. But there's very few companies who have overarching sort of ethical or bias at a fully governance level in the same way that they would hold teams accountable for security or privacy or things like that.
So it potentially only becomes something that is a focus if we keep talking about it and shouting about it and getting it out there. Rachel has asked, and this is a great question, are there any tools that any of you are using right now, or any of your teams, or that you're aware of globally, I suppose, that can help with bias when building AI products? Some sort of kind of screening software. If not, it's a great idea, she says, and I agree with you, Rachel. Anybody on that who's aware of any tools that can kind of help with that?
So inside Dell, we have something, did a presentation with a gentleman named Brian Reeves, who's one of our chief diversity and inclusion, I'm going to go with that. He's an awesome guy regardless. And part of what his charter was develop something called Bias Check, which is an internal program that we use for, from a human resources perspective, right? A lot of it's going out there to identify some of these preconceived notions that we have, call them notions, going to make it formal or make it kind of caricatures, right? But that was very, very instrumental. And that was something that we as a company have decided to kind of go down that path. We have some goals and targets around that as well. While not necessarily tied to the development of software. So some of these change to echo some of Jillian's points, it is something that there are, starting to be frameworks on that, and affects the people that are doing the job, right? And again, it becomes this, we're all part of this community. We all need to understand and go into these things eyes wide open, so to speak, and do it.
Yeah.
So, and I know Jillian's posting some stuff in the chat.
Do you know what I was going to say? I suddenly think that Gillian could be a bot, because she was able to do that so fast. I think she's been planted to be in this, because how did you have that so quickly? Can I just ask if that's a copy and paste from some document you have straight away?
Yeah. I have some various resources up on my screen. So there is a lot more than that. But if someone's looking for somewhere to start.
from now on, I am absolutely coming to Gillian for any questions, because that was just the most, the quickest response I've ever had to anything. I'm going to ask Nat's question here, so forgive me, I'm reading it for the first time. Is fairness or equity to goal? Fair treatment may still not be enough for disadvantaged groups. That's a really good point. So are we trying to suggest that basically it's not a level playing field, so you can't just put a step up and expect them to be at the same level? I think that's potentially what Nat's asking. Anybody want to jump in there?
It depends how you define fairness. No. I think
Depends on how you define equity and equal too.
yeah. Well, this is it. It's very tricky because you can have these biases that you've accidentally brought in, or they're your personal biases, but you can have biases that are completely reflective of real life bias. So all you've done is like, this is what the world is actually like, and I've used my sample data is exactly representative of the world, but this is as human, if you sit and think about it, you think that's unfair. So should you do that? Like, I know there was the CV screening tool that took in loads of data about it was all data about how they'd hired, and decided that your best two predictors of future success were that your name was Jared and that you played high school lacrosse, which if a human looks at that, you're going to go, it doesn't seem right. But you can also be exasperating future bias, which I think is probably where Nat's question is going. So you can be making bias worse by what you're doing, not just reflecting the world, but actually making it worse in terms of now you've started with reflecting the world and then sort of scaled that and amplified it. But the question comes back to how much, and maybe Dave and Diva will answer, how much is a company who's putting out AI responsible for making things better than they are? So not just reflecting the world, but actually improving the world. And should an individual company be making the call on what they think a better world looks like? Yeah.
I'm gonna ask Deva to jump in there. Let's move on, not move on, but obviously following on from Gillian's question, that question, and so therefore who's responsible if something goes wrong? Who's at fault? Is it society or the company?
So this is an interesting question, because that exact same question came up in a different discussion I was having, where they were asking, but who's responsible? Like, if the self-driving car murdered this person, because, this is the most common example people give, is then who's responsible? Is it the company who built it? Is it the engineer? Is it the marketing team? Or, is it the, I think the thing is with these things, now, obviously it's brilliant if the company actually takes some responsibility before I think things like this happen, because I think we do, as software engineers or people, working within companies, we ourselves do have a certain responsibility to make sure that whenever these are going out, because we are developing these products, therefore we are responsible to a degree. But at the same time, it's a difficult thing to do, because within a company, then you have the thing of, yeah, but who's actually responsible? Do we hold the executives responsible because they're the higher ups, or do we hold the programmers responsible because they're the ones who actually coded it? But the problem is it's not so straightforward. When it comes to the actual pipeline, there's so many people involved in all of this. Or do we hold the actual AI model responsible for ultimately making the decision? So I think, again, it is a tricky question to answer, but that's exactly why we need this governance, all of these governance to come into place, so that we have, because with everything else, so for example, with anything else in the world that has been there for a long time, even if it was like, so taking AI out of the equation, if we're talking about, say, a normal cleaning product, you have, a cleaning product in your house, it comes with all these, warning saying, do not use this for this, and this. If you use this, you're going to, it's going to have adverse effects. And if you do use it regardless of, not taking the warnings into account, then it's your problem, right? But the thing with AI at the minute is we don't have those warning labels on our AI systems, on our models, because it's just out there and we're still figuring out what we're doing, which is why we need to have these debates and, bring matters like this into everybody's focus. Because that's the thing with technology, because it always, you say it's kind of like a sigma curve. because like it's there in the beginning, nobody knows about it, and then suddenly everybody starts knowing about it, and then it plateaus, and then and everybody's like, oh, but AI was yesterday's news, and that's brilliant on the technologist side of you, because they're like, oh, if it was yesterday's news, that means everybody's using it, and it's in the society, and policies are there, rules are there, but we don't quite know where we are at in terms of AI on that curve yet, and we're kind of just the general public is starting to get a grasp of this. They're starting to understand, oh, AI is an issue, therefore bias is an issue. Like we're still finding our way. So in terms of who's responsible, to come back to the question again, at this stage, it's really difficult to say. I do think that individual companies do need to have a certain level of responsibility if they are putting a product out, because it is to a certain degree. But at the same time, there should also be governing bodies to make sure that people are held accountable, because nobody wants to take the responsibility, and especially when it comes to businesses, sometimes it's a difficult task, because again, it is a big pipeline in there, like there's different people and all that. But I think that's why we need the governance to be in place. The rules have to be in place, and that's going to be a thing of trial and error, just because of what AI is and the fact that we're just starting to it's out there, the general public, it's just starting to be mainstream.
Yeah. So like let's guess that we're 2 years away from that. 3 years. Anybody got a guess on how long it will be? And also my last question, and this is for another debate in itself, is surely someone's governance in one country is completely different to somewhere else completely opposite in the rest of the world. So do we have a global governance, or do we have a country governance? And then how does that work in a virtual world where there are no borders? Anybody want to tell me how long it's going to be before we have some kind of accountable body that measures AI? Dave's pointing towards Boston, and I'm in Derry. There's no way.
I don't know about that. Where's the wind blowing this week? I mean, I would hope, like I said, I would hope in my lifetime that some of this stuff gets addressed. I think the nature of humanity is such that we will always find these kind of rocks to stumble upon. Just simply is something that Deva said. Like you want something to become so ordinary or so normalized that you just don't think about it anymore, right? And I'd argue that philosophically that's great, but that familiarity breeds contempt for the process, breeds contempt for what ultimately ends up being there. So I would almost rather it continue to be a stumbling stone that we go over, that crack in the sidewalk that you continue to trip over as we go forward, and never get to the point where it is assumed to be normal or assumed to be normalized, right? Because it's always going to cause and bring us back. You can put checkpoints in place. You have public works, right, that are supposed to go out there and fix the cracks in the sidewalk. That's maintenance, and it's going to continue to be a thing. But given who we are as human beings, I really, really, it sounds negative, and I'm saying it with a smile on my face, I really want us to always have this problem with it. I always want there always will be agitators to this. Elon Musk points to this stuff right now, like, hey, you never want the machine to ultimately run everything, right? I'm building the machine within the machine, doing all this stuff. You want those agitators out there that are continuing postulating what's going to happen, what's going to occur, and that's great. But yeah, I would hope within my lifetime, that's my generic answer, that we'll get to something where there is more governance or more normalization. I think the second part of your question, whether or not countries are going to do this is a raging debate I always have. And it goes into ethics, and it goes into a whole bunch of stuff. East versus West. We established these rules and these statutes within our countries. Murder is bad. We've all decided that. We believe that this is bad. The government institutes things on that. However, let's pick a tribe that we have not discovered, or a community that we have not discovered, who believes that there is a concept of death that is at the hands of another person. That's okay. Who's right and who's wrong? That's an ethical dilemma. That's a question that feeds bias as part of that ethical kind of continuity. And that's an extreme example, and God forbid that should happen to anybody. But these type of things end up becoming the conversations, and it's always going to be this duality. We can call a certain Eastern country genocidal for what they are doing to a population of folks. I haven't seen any accountability from that side or from that government to say that what they're doing is wrong. The world's holding them, quote unquote, to account, but without that kind of enforcement, all it is just words and there's no actions behind it. So it's always going to be this duality of, you know, this is what we believe, this is the world government saying this, the UN is saying this, and then you kind of, you kiss the ring of it and move on, and the governments end up doing it themselves. You know, I'll point to my government. We're notorious for doing this kind of stuff, right? We want to participate, but we'll arbitrarily remove ourselves from the Paris Accords, for example, and then we'll join back in when it's convenient to us, right? That kind of stuff is going to happen all the time.
Wow, I think we need to end on that. Some really ethical questions, and some questions that we need to follow up on. I feel like this is potentially, and this is someone that's from outside of the technology industry. I'm not in the game of understanding how technology works, but I can talk about how people work together. And I think that's where we need and have started that conversation here. And I'm sure there's various panels throughout this week and for the rest of the year that are having similar conversations. And that can be only a good thing for the debate that is going to be building around, obviously, that. Hopefully, in the next few years, we'll all have a role within a company that is focused on AI and bias, as much as now we have, obviously, someone that focuses on, diversity and inclusion. And perhaps, obviously, that's a route that we can all take on a small company by company basis as well. Thank you ever so much for your time, Gillian, Deva, and Dave today, and also to Naomi and Tara for taking part and showcasing what they're doing. Hopefully, obviously, just